the last session of our forum. So our focus today or in our workshop is developing collaborative discourse communities in classrooms. So my name is Ariel Tichnor-Wagner. I am a faculty member in the Education Policy Studies program here at BU Wheelock.
I am Kaylene Stevens. I'm a clinical assistant professor in teaching and learning and a former social studies teacher and department chair for 14 years at Framingham High School.
Is this on? Yes. And I'm Annabel Stoler. I'm a PhD candidate here at BU Wheelock, and I'm a former middle school science teacher in Lexington, Massachusetts. I don't know if I should be the one doing this.
Please, go for it.
Oh, am I doing the agenda too? Okay, well, we're going to start by introducing ourselves. Then we will talk a bit about what do we mean by collaborative discourse. Then we will talk a bit about what collaborative discourse can look like specifically in science classrooms. And then we will talk about how it can look in social studies classrooms. And then we'll end with a collaborative discourse activity. There it is. We did this already. Yeah. This is us.
Okay, so before we get started, an important part of discourse is feeling that you have some sort of comfort with the people in the room. So we're going to ask you to turn and talk. Our teachers are familiar with turn and talk. Turn and talk to your neighbor or the closest person and share your name, the work you do, why you are here at the forum, and what you remember about middle school, good, bad, ugly. So that's your introduction. And then we're going to grapple with, these are going to be some of the themes throughout this workshop. We're going to grapple with why is uncertainty in discourse becoming so difficult everywhere and in education? So why are these concepts of being able to engage and talk to each other and lean into uncertainty, why are they so hard in education, and why are they so important, especially in the middle school years? So we're going to ask you to turn and have some discourse with your neighbors on these topics. Thank you. Come around and listen too. Why is uncertainty and discourse becoming so difficult? So this idea that like, when we teach kids, like there's no right answer, there's no one way to see things. Like on college campuses, like what initially drove us to this work, like it was like you're either right or you're wrong. I either agree with you or I disagree with you. There was like not a lot of ability to work in the gray, like and not like okay. Or like you either believe this or you believe that, or we do a debate and one side wins. And debate is very different than discourse. So this idea of uncertainty.
Music teacher.
right, so for the sake of time, we're going to wrap up our conversations for the moment. I'm still going to talk in the mic, even though I hopefully it won't be loud. But I'm wondering maybe if a few folks want to share, if you got to number 2, any thoughts that either yourself or someone that you were chatting with shared around kind of the challenges, right, of grappling with uncertainty and engaging in discourse in classrooms today?
We blame whiteness and time. So whiteness for the need for flattening of uncomfortable, and then time because the idea that you have to be on such a point at such a time, okay? That so much pressure on teachers. Yeah, to be at that point on Wednesday. The next thing, everybody has to be at the same time on that time. So that rigidity. So we don't have time for uncertainty and family.
Yeah, no, that's really good. I think like part of white supremacy culture is this idea that there's a right answer and there's a wrong answer and there's no in between. Kathy, did you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, a lot of teachers I've talked to say, the assistant principal is going to come in and observe me, and if the students are just kind of bumbling around uncertainly in some discussion, they're going to say, what are you wasting your time on that for? So that's a challenge.
I think also the important piece, at least I teach math, and in 6th grade I had a terrible, boring math teacher. We did a project on the stock market. And it was 11. Like, what's that? No one knows what that is. But and then in 7th and 8th grade I had the same teacher and absolutely loved that teacher. And I think in middle school you make a lot of choices about yourself and what you're good and what you're bad at, and that kind of polarizing idea. And so I think making kids comfortable in the unknown and the not knowing being okay, and the liking things or changing your minds about things and yourself. And I think modeling that for them and giving them the space to make those choices and then change their minds and try new things and explore is really important.
I think too, like the importance of being wrong, right? Like a lot of my successes come from my failures, right? So like being able to, and I'm speaking about as we become more comfortable teaching, like become like I don't know the answer to that, but you know what? That doesn't mean I don't want to know. Like go home and like this week, a student actually asked me something I didn't know, and I went like, and it got me thrown off, and I pretended that I did. Then I went home and I researched it, and I brought it back, but I was then truthful, like. You put me on my toes. That was awesome. You made me go home and research. And now I'm learning from your work, and it shows kids like this is what wrong brought us to, right? We're not.
Yeah, we have a responsibility as the adults to model uncertainty and not knowing, and a lot of adults have a hard time that with that level of vulnerability being like, ooh, I don't have the answer to that, or there's no right answer to that, right?
Why are we like a science and social studies kind of meshed together? Right, I think actually Michael Medina, as he was talking, really like keyed up very nicely for thinking about like why discourse matters across content areas, right? So for those who were in the keynote, he talked really, he really pointed to the importance, right, of consistency, right? So if you're practicing these similar routines consistently within your own classrooms, but then you have that space, right, to engage in uncertainty, to engage in discourse across classrooms, how that just gets reinforced and creates those open spaces, right, for having more robust, sometimes more challenging, right, and sometimes difficult conversations. And so as we came together to kind of think about kind of where is that synergy, right, between science and social studies, and for those who are teaching other subjects, right, as well, right, thinking about kind of how your own kind of subject area or content area that you're teaching fits in, right, there's kind of these shared starting points, right, that we have. One is the idea that learning, right, is both a social process and a collaborative process, and this becomes all the more important for adolescents, right, as well, as we kind of talk about the point that they want to be social, right, their peer groups, right, are heavily influencing kind of their identities at the moment. Also this idea, right, of collaborative discourse, right, moving away more from debate, so this idea of like right versus wrong, or you have to take my side or your side, but moving towards this idea of just having these conversations, right, and dealing with that in between. Right, we also kind of come together under the shared belief around skills for discourse should be explicitly taught, right? So these are not just something that we can assume anyone can jump into a conversation, but you have to really kind of set the stage and teach what these skills are, and also continuously embed them, right, across content lessons. And lastly, the idea that collaborative discourse really leans into nuance and complexity, right, of the problems being addressed.
All right, so I'm going to kick us off talking about science, and I'm going to use the presenter notes and maybe the microphone. Yes. Okay, great. So I'll be again starting talking about my team's work with collaborative discourse in science classrooms. So we know that collaborative discourse can be challenging to enact in classrooms, right? Many of us have experienced this. I will start this presentation by giving you an example of some of the challenges, and I'm sure many of you will be able to relate. So in this classroom, Ms. Shaw has just asked her 25 students to discuss ideas for an investigation design with their table groups, and she's now bringing them back together to share their ideas with the whole class. So she begins by asking students, what could we do, or how could we design a test that would help us answer this question? And although during the small group part of this conversation, the room was filled with voices, kids were talking, they were really excited, as soon as she asked the whole group question, only 3 hands go up. I see some people nodding that we have all experienced this. And not only have only 3 kids raised their hand, they are all kids that frequently participate. They're all boys. They're typically positioned as like the smart kids in this room. Additionally, one of these students is on an IEP for behavioral support, and he frequently has frustrated outbursts when he isn't called on. So now Ms. Shaw is having to make some decisions, right, about how she's going to engage the class in this collaborative discourse. She goes ahead and calls on this student. She hears his idea, and she decides to keep the discussion going. So she asks, what do others think about this? And again, the same 3 kids raise their hands, including the kid who just talked. And she decides to change her course again. So she decides to cold call. She says, let's hear from some new voices. Naomi, what do you think about this? She calls on Naomi, a quiet girl who rarely talks. But as Naomi is talking, Ms. Shaw is really trying to hear her and be able to respond to her ideas. But she's having trouble because she's noticing that one student's picked up a pencil and is throwing it, another student's put her head down, and 2 students are now whispering. So this really kind of shows that teaching is really hard, and engaging kids in discourse can be really challenging. And a lot of us have experienced this in our own classrooms, just like Ms. Shaw. So in this talk, I'll develop some strategies that the research team, including Ms. Shaw, and I have developed to support teachers and children to use collaborative discourse in their classrooms. So I'll start by talking about the role of uncertainty in scientists' work. This is really what drives my team's research, and I want to give credit where credit is due, that this is led by my advisor, Dr. Eve Manns. So if you have questions about productive uncertainty, you can email me, but she's really the expert here. So scientific work is a process of recognizing and managing uncertainty. So sorry if this is like too soon, but think back to 2020, those first few weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of us were wondering, do we need to sanitize our groceries? Can we go outside and touch things? And there were some initial experiments that suggested that COVID could land on these surfaces and stay there. So there was ideas that like cardboard can hold COVID for 24 hours. But then scientists started to think more about this. And they were like, well, what about being outside is different from being in a lab? How much COVID actually has to land on something and stay alive and then get picked up by you for you to actually get sick? And when those uncertainties were explored more, it became more clear to us that we no longer needed to sanitize our mail and groceries, even though those initial lab results might have indicated that to us. So these kinds of uncertainties are central to scientific activity. Scientists collectively develop explanations because they're unsure what matters, how it matters, and they do this through engaging in discourse with each other. They grapple with how to set up experiments, how these experiments are different from real life. They argue because they disagree. They gather evidence, and they develop norms for what counts as sufficient evidence. Uncertainty motivates and provides the context for the practice of science. However, In classrooms, this is often minimized. This is one of the first images when you Google image science experiment classroom, where the kid is actually not getting to engage with any uncertainty. They are told a set of directions to follow. They follow the directions. The volcano bubbles. The teacher says, good job. If the volcano doesn't bubble, it's because you did something wrong. You don't understand. And this is really central to our team's argument, is that since uncertainty is central to scientists' work, it needs to be central to the work that we do with our children as well. Experiencing uncertainty can help our students become critical consumers of science information. The idea that scientists change their conclusions based on new evidence is often used, or I should say misused, to create public mistrust in science. But if you've experienced uncertainty in your own science work and participated in the practices used to manage it, you may actually come to trust science more because you recognize the processes of community scrutiny and discourse that scientific findings have undergone. And just want to also point out this book, Uncertain, the Wit and Wisdom and Wonder of Being Unsure by Maggie Jackson, is a really great book on the role of uncertainty in science and in our real lives, and I would really recommend reading it if you want to learn more about the power of uncertainty. And further, research in neuroscience and developmental psychology suggests that uncertainty supports human engagement with materials and with each other. In studies of toddlers and preschoolers, researchers have found that children engage in more explanatory play and use more strategies for testing evidence with a toy that is designed to be difficult to figure out. This is actually my daughter, Talia. She's 15 months old. And she can sit with this for a long time because there's a lot of figuring out, like, how does this go on to here? What if I switch up the disorder? Compared to the more annoying toys I try to keep out of my house, but my mother-in-law keeps buying, where you press one button and it makes the same noise over and over. Many of you with kids can realize that this often doesn't really entertain them for that long and drives you bonkers. When we're surprised, our brains actually produce noradrenaline, which is a hormone that makes us more alert and attentive. So surprise and engaging with uncertainty actually alters our brain's uncertainty and our ability to engage with that uncertainty. And when we lean into the uncertainty about how things work, this allows us to actually figure things out. We often know less than we actually think that we do. The example I like to use for this is the example of a lock and a key. You probably use this almost every day. You put a key into a lock, you open your door, you move on with your life. But when you really think about it, do you really understand exactly what's happening? Could you draw a model to show what's going on inside the lock? And when we lean into this allows us to actually start figuring things out. So now I'll talk more specifically about what this looks like in science classroom. So those of you who teach science, these should look very familiar to you. These are the science and engineering practices outlined in the Next Generation Science Standards. And we found that students engage more meaningfully with these standards when they're engaging in tasks that elicit uncertainty, that have more than one plausible answer, that spark disagreement, that don't quite fit with what they expect, and they're able to talk about those. So we'll take this example of the practice of engaging in argumentation from evidence. And a lot of times what happens in classrooms, I don't know if anyone else can relate, this happened to me a lot as a 6th grade science teacher. I would want my kids to engage in argumentation, but I only gave them very specific pieces of evidence they could use. And what happened is it was like pulling teeth to try to get an answer or to try to get a discussion going. I'll give you an example. This is actually from 2nd grade, but I just love this example. We asked students to engage in argumentation about phase change. So what typically happens in 2nd grade classrooms is teachers give kids an ice cube, the ice cube melts, and they say, engage in argumentation, tell me evidence for how you know the ice melted. And they say, well, it turned into water. They're like, okay, so how do you know? Well, it melted. How do you know? It turned into water. You go back and forth, and there's really nothing to engage with. So instead, our team redesigned this investigation to have kids melt chocolate chips. And now there's uncertainty, and now there's discourse. Because some kids are saying, well, it's still solid. It's kept, like, the chocolate chips have kept their shape. I can't pour them. But then other kids say, well, actually, they've kind of melted to take the shape of the container. And if I pour it really slowly, it will still pour. So Here, students are really using the practices, like they're actually engaging in the practice of argumentation. They're using the properties of matter. They're agreeing and disagreeing based on evidence, and they're really thinking deeply about what the evidence means. So now I'll connect this idea of uncertainty to how this supports students' ability to engage in collaborative, productive discourse. So when students have opportunities to engage with uncertainty, they're able to make sense of complex science ideas. And this gives them a reason to actually engage with each other. The ideas are complex enough that there's actually a need to engage in discourse. And through this discussion, students are able to revise and refine their ideas. And this often happens publicly, where kids are saying, you gave me a new idea that's helping me change my thinking, ideally, right? And to do this, students need to work collectively, and they need to grapple with multiple explanations and ideas. And as this is happening, this gives students and teachers opportunities to treat each other and their ideas with care by listening to their ideas, taking them up, and highlighting them to other people. But in order for this to happen, there needs to be a culture of caring discourse in these classrooms. So when I talk about classroom culture, I'm referring to the spoken and unspoken expectations that guide how students and teachers interact with one another and learn together. And our work on classroom culture is guided by 3 main ideas. First, classroom culture involves expectation for both knowledge and relationships. Children and teachers expect each other to know certain things, to develop knowledge of certain things, and to interact in certain ways. And these are very deeply interwoven. You can't have a separate norm or expectation that only addresses knowledge construction or only addresses relationship construction. And these are developed through meaningful activity. They need to happen as children and teachers are engaging together, not just at the start of class when you tell kids, today we're gonna follow this, or pointing to the norm that you have written on the wall. So this means that classroom cultures need to form over time and that they take work to develop. And finally, we need to recognize that we're working within larger power structures that are deeply inequitable. Children come into our classrooms with identities that have historically labeled them as less capable students. And if we don't seek to disrupt those structures in our own teaching and our own role in classroom culture, only some of our students will be afforded the opportunity to have their ideas highlighted and cared for. And we can disrupt some of these narratives by making our classroom spaces where diverse ways of contributing are valued. And on the next few slides, I'll show you the approaches that our team takes to developing and using classroom norms that can address these. Oh, go back. I've never had a clicker before. This is very exciting. So a central part of this work is that it's collective. When we talk about uncertainty, we aren't just saying that one person is uncertain about something. Instead, we're focusing on the idea of a group of students being unsure about why or how something happens, and then providing opportunities for them to work together to develop that explanation. So in all of our work, we really emphasize the strengths of students learning with and from each other. And we also know that this doesn't happen automatically. It doesn't come for free. You can't just walk into the classroom and say, I want my kids to engage in these ways, and then it just happens. We have to develop classroom norms and structures that support this work, and we have to use them over time. So these are the norms that we've developed in our work with teachers and that we found helpful to use with students. We learn science by asking questions to help us figure things out. So when we do this, we're positioning science not just as a body of knowledge, but a practice in which children are able to engage in sense-making. It's okay or even great to be unsure. We value questions and uncertainties just as much as the answers. Oh no. We value everyone's ideas and experiences. We disrupt traditional ideas about what background knowledge is relevant. And we learn from each other's ideas. Science is a collective endeavor, not just an individual one. And these, again, I have to shout out Ms. Shaw from that first vignette, that she was really helpful in developing these norms. And it's really important to note that it's not just enough to introduce these norms before students start working together. Students need to have opportunities to actually embody these norms through disciplinary activity. So for example, if you say to kids, today we're gonna work on the norm, we learn science by asking questions to figure things out, but then you don't ever actually give kids the chance to ask questions, or you have them ask questions and immediately go to answering them, they haven't really embodied that norm. You just sort of paid lip service to it. So the approach that we use, we sort of take like a 3-tiered approach to using norms in science classrooms that center uncertainty and collective discourse. So first, norms need to be explicitly introduced either by the teacher or often with older kids, we'll do like a co-construction activity that involves students. And we found it really helpful to engage kids in what that norm would actually look like. So for example, we might say to kids, hey, in this classroom, this is a place where everyone's ideas are valued. What would that sound like? What sort of things would you want your teacher to say to show that? What sorts of ideas and actions do you all need to do in order to embody that norm? And kids, especially middle schoolers, are really good at this. They are really great at thinking about, like, what do I want to see? And I found it really helpful to also ask them what they want their teacher to see. They love that. Then we need to actually give students activities in which they can embody the norms. So if we say we learn from each other's ideas, then they have to actually learn from each other's ideas. So what we've done is develop activities where students can present their work, such as models that they've drawn, and then other students can ask questions, but then importantly, we give everyone time to go back and revise their models based on what they just heard. So it's not just about presenting and hearing, it's about actually changing your thinking based on what your peers are saying. And finally, developing a collaborative and kind classroom culture isn't something you can just set and forget. You have to, throughout the school year, reflect on these norms and refine them accordingly. So you might periodically have discussions with your students about how things are going, or maybe you use a survey to better understand students' experiences. I'll show you some examples of what this work can look like in classrooms to support productive and caring science discourse. So again, like I said before, this is from an activity where kids were drawing models. They heard from each other, and then we gave them Post-its and said, write on your Post-it what you would change, or if you would change anything based on what you just heard. Students worked together in this class to create a class consensus model explaining a phenomenon after a unit of study. Most of the classrooms that we work in use a driving question board, where throughout the unit, kids can ask questions, and those are really valued and highlighted, and the teacher or the students will put them up in this public-facing space. And they'll often frequently pause throughout the unit and say, hey, let's go back and look at that driving question board and figure out if there's anything on here that we can answer, or maybe if we have new questions based on what we thought before. And finally, this is a screenshot from a slide from Ms. Shaw's class where we gave students a survey. And again, I think a lot of us, at least for me as a teacher, I would often survey my students, and then I was like, now what? What do I actually do? Or I would make changes to my own practice, but I never engaged the kids in it. So what we've started doing is we'll take one piece of that data. So we'll often take one survey question, and we will have a class discussion with the kids. We'll say, this is the data. This is what your peers are saying. And then we'll engage in a discussion about it. So I've been talking for a while. I'm now going to let you all have the opportunity to engage in some discourse, which we will be coming back to later in the second part of the presentation. But it would be wonderful if you could get back into your same groups as before and think about what struggles do you see middle schoolers having while engaging. And I said science discourse, but it really could be anything. I know not everybody here is a science teacher. And how might you address these? Are there norms that you're currently using in your science classroom or your classroom, and are you satisfied with them? If you're not, are there things you might want to try? Or is there something else you might want to try to support students to engage in discourse? And this could be, so these are some like different things that I said from the slides, but of course it could be anything. So I'll give you all about 5-ish minutes to talk in your small groups about this.
Okay, so we got like 30. And we started maybe. we have all this, yeah. Jason Reynolds was awesome last night. He was so good. He was so empowering, and we were like, what? Development is so close. We left over. Hey, there's have to be more workshops. Just in the interest of time, we're going to bring you back.
All right. Also, for the interest of time, I don't think we will share out. I think I will just move on so I can let my next two co-presenters get started. But I do want to just share a quick summary of what I just talked about, is that it's productive and powerful for children to experience uncertainty as they engage in science practice. And this uncertainty can create opportunities for collaborative discourse. But for this to be productive, there needs to be a classroom culture that supports children to treat each other and their ideas with care. And to do this, we can explicitly introduce norms, use these in activities, sorry, I clicked too many things at once. Use them in activities that establish a need for them and refine them as needed. So if you're interested in learning more, I have a couple of shameless plugs. One is that my advisor, Eve, and I have recently written a book that comes out in about a month. And one chapter that I wrote is all about this stuff. So if you'd like to read more, we'd love for you to order. This goes to our website, and there's a link there to pre-order. And also, if you would like to chat further about any of this, here's my contact information. And my LinkedIn is Annabel Stoler. I'm also on the job market, so if anybody is in academia or working for a district and you thought I sounded really cool and want to work with me, please let me know. All right, I will turn it over to my co-presenters. Oh, that was it. Oh, yeah, sorry. This is my virtual card, if anybody wants that. But I'll hand it over to you.
All right, so now we're going to pretend to be middle school. We're going to grab our backpacks, our binders, and walk over to our social studies classroom. And, right, like time, right, still a challenge here, too, right? The bell just rang. No, but so now as we kind of move on to thinking about now how we do discourse, right, in the social studies classroom, right? I want everyone to be thinking as well about kind of where some of these synergies are, right? And so if you're a student, right, who literally is walking over from science, your next period social studies, right, are you feeling like congruence? Are you suddenly, feeling discordant and I have a whole new set of norms? So like really, again, the importance, right, of kind of being on the same page across, right, different content areas, right, when it comes to these types of collaborative discourse skills. All right, so I am a fast talker. I am going to talk quickly in the interest of time so that everyone can then talk to one another. So anyone just pause if I am going too fast. But as we kind of switch over to thinking about discourse, right, within social studies classrooms and specifically civic like civic-oriented social studies units, what does civic discourse mean? So we frame it as deliberative dialogue and discussion, right? That's designed to foster mutual understanding, right, and to ultimately inform civic action, right? So you may have heard, terms like civil discourse as well, right? Well, how we kind of differentiate that, right, is that the idea of civic discourse is that it's teaching you to kind of dialogue, right, in the spirit of then being able to act, right, after kind of engaging in conversation. And it really answers this core question, right, of what do we do, right, and we being kind of a collective community, whether it's a classroom community, a school community, a broader, state community, right, if you will. And particularly if you're teaching history, right, you could actually kind of use this framework to think about the question of like, what could we have done, right, or what could have been done, right, about historical events. And so through, I won't take the time to share, but I was happy to talk after, but through kind of a multi-phase process in which we're kind of still in the process of collecting data and feedback from educators across the country. So if anyone does have feedback, we are always open for feedback. Where we're developing this framework for what civic discourse looks like in the classroom, and we call it the peace principles, right? So it begins with kind of the idea is kind of the ultimate goal, right, is at the end of engaging students in empowered action. How do we get there, right? Well, we get there by first kind of engaging students in conversations with one another, but before students can even engage in conversations, right, it's important to backtrack and really kind of students to ground themselves, right, and what they already know about an issue, provide them opportunities to engage with different perspectives on the issue, which then will allow them to engage in conversation and then ultimately, right, take informed action. And I won't talk too much on this slide because I think it's clear that before engaging, right, in discourse, it's important to kind of really set and create classroom environments that ensure that students feel comfortable, right, speaking up, speaking to one another, disagreeing with one another, right, and whatnot. And so we'll skip through some of these norms. I mean, read them, please. but kind of these norms kind of are all focused, right, on fostering that classroom environment from day one. It's also important, and we think about for teachers, right, when you're thinking about kind of topics for actively teaching, right, civic discourse, to focus on these questions, right, of kind of like, what do we do about something, right, or what could we have done, or what could folks have done historically in the past. Right, important to draw upon students' experiences and interests. And also when you're thinking about topics, right, for civic discourse, right, valuing who students are, right, in the communities, right, where they're from. So this goes back to, I think was kind of the keynote, just the importance of relationships and knowing your students, right, and providing those opportunities for students to be able to share, like, well, like, I just heard about this in the news last night, like, we need to talk about this, right, so kind of making sure that you have those spaces to do that. Right, and importantly, right, topics that have multiple possible solutions, right, and are also kind of, connected to possible actions. So kind of the first step, right, and we think about kind of civic discourse as a skill set, is being able to kind of individually, right, kind of reflect and recognize your own perspectives, right, on a given issue. So this is really about kind of identifying your viewpoints, really thinking kind of about, who you are and the experiences that you've had as an individual that kind of shape those different perspectives that you hold. Thinking too about kind of how your own viewpoints may impact others, right, and then just, having that open mind to step beyond your comfort zone, right, and to be able to think about issues in new ways. So often, especially kind of when we've talked to civic education experts in the field, right, something that comes up a lot is like, it is uncomfortable, right, and there is this tension, right, around kind of having uncomfortable conversations. It can be uncomfortable to engage in perspectives that aren't the same as yours, and so kind of thinking about kind of how do we create safe spaces that allow students to be in that uncertain space, right, as well. Then empathetic engagement, right, is providing students opportunities to seek out multiple points of view on a topic. So this is really kind of media literacy heavy, right, as you're kind of providing students different multimedia to examine sources of where you're getting information from, why sources might portray topics in different ways, right, and thinking about kind of whose views are represented in, right, and also whose views are missing from those different sources. Right, this also goes with the students are examining kind of different sources, right, to distinguish between facts, opinions, right, and unsubstantiated claims, and to be able to kind of identify also like historical context surrounding an issue. issue, right? So kind of here's what someone's saying now, here's what's happening now, kind of how do we get to this point? And also importantly, right, kind of being able to attend to your emotional responses, right, to different perspectives that you do encounter. So after empathetic engagement, right, is this idea of beginning to join the conversation, right? And so this active listening and collaborative conversation really do go hand in hand. So when it comes to active listening, right, the idea is that you're kind of in the moment when someone else is talking, right, you're really listening to listen, not to respond, right? You will have a space and opportunity to respond, but kind of in the moment as you're listening to make sure that you're really attuned to both the content and what someone's saying, the emotions that they're conveying, right, along with kind of what their personal point of view is. And so kind of, again, in that moment, right, not interjecting your own opinions, interrupting, right, or having side conversations. Obviously, kind of, you can't, you have biases. You're not going to withhold, like, well, I do feel this about this, right? You will have that space to share back. But in that moment, really important to really kind of just understand what that person is saying. And then, a part of that active listening, right, is that you're actually kind of engaging in collaborative conversations with your peers, right? So kind of a few norms is this importance of kind of speaking right from the personal I. So as you engage in conversations, you're teaching students to engage in conversation, right? Being clear that they're talking about, their point of view. They're not speaking for a group of people. Making sure that there's norms set so that all participants, right, do have, and everyone who's engaging in that conversation, whether it's whole group, whether it's small group, right, have an equal opportunity to share. Asking deep questions of one another, right, and using evidence, right, to support your claims. Establishing common ground, values, right, and points of connection, while also recognizing areas of dissent, right, or disagreement, and really kind of focusing, right, on this idea of mutual understanding of one another, not necessarily kind of consensus, right, around something. And then just noting, that conversations can get messy. Things can be said that might hurt or harm other students in the class, and kind of making sure that as educators to be prepared, right, to pause, repair, stop, and make sure that kind of, again, all students, right, if things that are said that are harmful, that you do stop those conversations, right, and engage in practices to make sure that, again, those issues are addressed and students can feel safe, right, continuing to engage. And again, I think this is one of those reasons why teachers, can balk at, and we've gotten some feedback, you can't control what students are saying, right? So when you kind of open up the door for students to share, right, like things, can veer off, right, in direction. So as a teacher to have those strategies, right, to make sure that you can support your students moving forward. All right, and lastly is the idea of empowered action, right? So kind of after students are able to engage in conversations right around this question of what do we do, right? Students kind of can think through here's what we're going to do now, right? And so the idea of dialogue is that you can begin to imagine new possibilities, right, based on what was learned through those other stages, and to be able to kind of identify some collaborative changes, right, or collaborative steps to be taken, right, that do embrace complexity, right, and nuance of differing viewpoints. Also understanding that maybe not everyone is going to agree on an action, and that is also okay. Right, and then, but the idea being that kind of when actions are taken, right, that they, are able to benefit multiple community interests, right? And I think often we think of civic discourse as, engaging with folks from the opposite side of the aisle, right, or engaging people with opposite point of views. Sometimes, we might, have, share goals and values and the same kind of ideas about what we ultimately want to see, but as you engage in dialogue, you might realize, like, we maybe have different visions and ideas of getting there. So not to kind of make, assumptions about the actions we should take, but being able to make sure that through dialogue, right, that students are coming up with actions that really kind of, take in multiple positions to account. All right. I will stop talking and now I'll turn over to Kaylene to give everyone an opportunity to practice some of this stuff.
Well, you've done a really good job being active listeners on a Friday afternoon, so thank you. We're done talking, hopefully, and we're going to have you all practice some of the peace principles. So this handout right here, collaborative conversation. So we're going to have you engage in a collaborative conversation with a group that you all have been talking to for a while. Note, this is not a perfect scenario. You have lots of unknowns, so we really have to lean into the uncertainty. But we're going to use the C and the peace principles, collaborative conversations, to discuss two of these scenarios. And of course, we have some norms, which I think you all probably are aware of, since we have many teachers in the room and educators using I statements, challenging ideas, grounding yourself, and thinking about time and that kind of stuff. And then there's also, at the bottom of the handout, it talks about how you can use deep questioning and active listening in order to help you with this. So these are our scenarios. You are on a school board and about to vote on if your district should allow religious exemptions for measles vaccines. Discuss how you might vote and why you are advocating for one policy over the other. So you could choose that one. Or scenario 2, you are a researcher and you've been asked to rewrite your grant proposal to avoid using words that promote equity, diversity, and inclusion. This doesn't feel close to home to any of us. I don't know. Right, your research team has have to decide if they will rewrite the proposal or not. Discuss your opinion and why you might advocate to rewrite it or not. So you can choose a scenario and engage in collaborative conversations. Now remember, we're leaning into the uncertainty. You don't know, if not rewriting your grant might mean that one of your researchers is now not funded. You don't know about the religious beliefs of those in your community, right? So you have a lot of uncertainties. These are issues that we're grappling. So let's see if we can engage in a collaborative conversation.
Before though, sorry.
Oh yes, my wonderful colleague is going to make you do some perspective recognition, which is a really important part of this.
So for the sake of time, I keep saying this now, I keep thinking about the challenge of time, right? We're living it, guys, right? But for some pre-dialogue, right? So before you engage in conversations, maybe we'll just take a minute, and these are some questions up here. I won't read them out loud, but to really kind of reflect on kind of what your perspectives are on the issue, maybe why you feel that way, what you're curious to still understand, what identities you're bringing to the conversation, the complexity, perhaps, right, of your own identities. Right, and how kind of, maybe to begin to think through how others might think differently from you, kind of based on where they're coming from and sitting from. So maybe we'll just take 1 minute. Yeah. And in a classroom, maybe it might take like 5 or 10 minutes, right, to engage in this reflection. So
I don't know about you, but I have some big feelings around DEI and vaccines, right? So taking a moment to check in with myself and do this pre-work is really important for me before I lead or facilitate a discussion on it or have one. So take some time to check in with yourself on some of these questions. In an ideal world, we'd have a lot more time. But that's the P piece, right? The recognizing your own perspective. We don't have a ton of time to do the empathetic engagement, the sourcing, the figuring all the things out. So we're glazing over those steps. But in a classroom, you'd want to make sure you have time for the E, time for the active listening before you do the C, which is the collaborative conversation piece. But we're going to do this, right? And it might be helpful before you start the conversation with your neighbor. We'll choose your scenario. Once you've done that, what do you have in common? What do you value, right? So, and getting at these ideas, you have to ask deep questions rather than surface questions like, are you vaccinated? That's a yes or no surface question. A deep question are, what are your fears and values around health? What do you think about bodily autonomy? Those are deeper questions to get at the root of the values of an issue around this. Again, it might also be really important to come up with what are some things that we agree on, right? We agree, and if we're thinking about research, right? We agree that funding allows us to do the work. We agree that we value belonging and welcoming to all. We agree that this work is important. And the last thing is, we don't necessarily need to come to an agreement on this, but we want to be able to come to a better understanding of how the other person's point of view is, right? So let's try it. Are y'all game? Okay. These are things that I think we're talking about and thinking about now. So talk to the people you are, go through a scenario, and how long?
Then we can take till 2:10, right?
Yeah.
10 minutes?
Okay, perfect. We'll take till 2:10.
The next one's the activity reflection. It's not. Because that should be there. That should be there.
You did great. Getting through them quickly. That one. Hi, everybody. Take like 30 seconds and wrap up your conversations.
In that 30 seconds, right? First question is, how did the conversation end? Did your group come up to a compromise? So maybe think about how your group might answer.
Okay, everybody, I'm very eager to hear from all of you and what you did. Seems like people engage in collaborative conversations. I think everybody chose scenario 2. Did anyone choose scenario 1?
We were stuck on scenario 1.
Oh, good.
Then we did a whole reanalysis of what is an I statement, and that was what we did.
Spoken like true academics. Thank you. All right, so I'm interested in how your conversations ended. Did you come up with an agreement or disagreement? Remember, the point of all of this is not debate, is not one side wins, but discourse, right? And civic discourse, discourse to then collectively agree what action we're going to take. So does anyone want to share on that, or any of the three, how you felt engaging in this? And then, of course, we're going to end by bringing back to, why is this important in the middle school classroom, and how might middle schoolers think about this? But in the first two, how did your conversations end, and how did you feel about it? Thank you, Cassandra.
So in our group, it was really nice to hear the different perspectives because everyone is at a different stage of their career or in different jobs. And so, and everyone obviously has different lived experiences. So it was really interesting seeing those perspectives come together and just trying to be, like, personally I try not to be mindful, but being extra mindful using, like, the structure that was given to be able to, like, really actively listen and then contribute people's thoughts towards, like, our, ultimately we agreed on, like, a decision, but being able to hold space for that. And? Well, our answer?
There is no right answer, right? We're leading into the uncertainty, but I am curious to hear.
Our group decided there was a right answer.
Oh, okay.
And so ultimately we decided as a group that we would not rewrite the grant proposal, that we would, one, because of the ever-moving bar of they'll just choose a new word that's not allowed, but also the fact that, like, luckily people in our group are from organizations that in theory, like, are not funded by the federal government, so we could also look for non-federal funds in order to pursue our project.
Thank you. Others?
For us, we were not able to come to a decision.
That's okay. That's part of it.
I think, like, one of the things that came up was, like, comfortability, right? Like, I think when we get, one of the things about this one, I feel like it's a little bit liberal, I could be crazy.
Oh, I don't know where you get that idea from.
But it's like when you have these conversations, I mean, I think what's interesting is, like, today, right, we're having these conversations, and generally the people we're discussing, like, I get the feel in my group that everybody's in agreement, right? In other groups, this dynamic changes significantly, right? So, like, I think that's there, but the comfortability, I think getting what's uncomfortable to you out first, right? For me, like, one of the things is,
And if you were doing that with kids, think about how much more meaningful what you just said would be if you were in middle school to hear someone say something like that or think that. Then we came to a consensus and it is A, right? The fact that you reflected about your own identity, some of the historical context involved in that, and why that makes it so difficult to come up with an answer. Right? In classrooms, we're often like, okay, what's the right answer? Check A, right? And that's part of today's presentation, is leaning into the uncertainty. So thank you. Others? It seemed like
I really didn't, but I thought you were putting me on the spot.
oh, I
so
heard it. I thought
I'm gonna do it anyway.
No, we were like,
No,
Oh, it was a few.
our conversation, we are, became a much more nuanced consensus, and I would say we didn't feel comfortable with how we came to that consensus. And it had to do with more the political structures of, we were talking specifically about our own state agency of education in Vermont, and how they are kind of whitewashing the language of our accreditation requirements in our teacher education programs, and thereby kind of throwing all the teacher education programs under the bus if they don't change their language to align to what they want to defer to with the Department of Education. So we were talking about that, and it became more nuanced because I'm from a Catholic Catholic college, St. Michael's in Vermont, and the language that we're using now is under the Catholic Education Mission, which has different words, but it's all the same stuff that DEI is all about. And so through our social mission, we can continue to use the language that we're using, but are we then throwing the other teacher education programs in Vermont that are publicly funded under the bus, basically, because we're going under a different set of kind of norms and rules. So what do? Do we change our language, or do we keep it?
So, and I'm a classroom teacher, so I focused on our state law, which has Act 1, which is about equity. So because our state law is about equity, can I just keep doing that because it's state and not yet federally imposed, right?
And then we start talking about whether the agency of education we want to rescind that law. So, a little more complicated.
So make sure I did not forget my point, sorry. So we did not come to a conclusion. However, one of the things that we started to have a discussion about is like what's at stake if we don't change it, right? And are we putting our students, if we were to speak up, are we putting our students in more of a precarious situation? And then also, if we were to change this language, it doesn't change the work that we're doing, right? Like, we're still an organization that's committed to DEI and is integral to the work that we do. And just to tell you a little bit more of my work, I hire and retain teachers in the School of Lynn. And regardless of the change in our language, that doesn't change us trying to diversify the educator workforce. So I think that was something that like I had to grapple with too, as we see this happening in a lot of organizations around the changing in statements.
And I can see all the peace principles at work with this, which is amazing, that you're actively listening to each other, that you're thinking about perspective recognition, like, oh, what are my identities? Where am I situated? I'm at a Catholic school, I have these rules. I'm at a nonprofit, I have this going on, right? So that is all important when we have these conversations, right? And they're not easy answers, and we tried to make these scenarios purposely difficult ones. So I don't know how we're doing on time, but okay, okay, well, we're done then. I was gonna say, this is important in the middle school classroom too, and for all the reasons that we have been talking about throughout the entire forum, this idea of middle school, I think I loved what Penny said, go away, but stay close, right, is the middle schooler. So this idea that I can deal with these big ideas and think about them, but I need a framework. I need someone to help me guide through, and peace is one avenue to do that. So thank you. There are emails.